This is Tom Rowlands-Rees, and you're listening to Switched On, the podcast brought to you by BloombergNEF. A massive build-out of data center capacity is underway. BloombergNEF is tracking nearly 23 gigawatts of new data center capacity under construction worldwide, more than a third of today's installed computing base, as AI and cloud workloads drive the next phase of digital infrastructure growth. But deciding where to build is becoming more complex. Energy availability has emerged as a defining constraint, with developers prioritizing markets that can deliver large, reliable grid connections quickly. At the same time, land permitting, tax regimes, fiber connectivity, and the presence of existing data center ecosystems all shape how competitive a market really is. As AI workloads scale and sovereign ambitions grow, new regions, from the Nordics to the Middle East and Latin America, are positioning themselves to capture the next wave of development. So, what determines which markets win the race to host the new generation of data centers? Today, I'm joined by Lloyd Arnold, an analyst from BNEF's Technology and Innovations team, to review findings from their note, Data Center Development, Regional Drivers and Hurdles. BNEF clients can find this note along with other data center research by heading to BNEF Go on the Bloomberg terminal or bnef.com. If you'd like to learn more about how BNEF approaches strategy research on the energy transition, including developments in commodity markets, trends across different sectors, and the cross-cutting technologies shaping the future, you can find more information on bnef.com. And if you'd like to speak with a member of our team about becoming a client, email us at sales.bnef@bloomberg.net. But for now, let's explore which markets are best positioned for new data centers. Welcome to the show, Lloyd.
Morning, Tom. Thanks for having me here.
We're here talking about a report that you recently published. Just kick us off with explaining this sort of report on data center development drivers. What were we trying to accomplish there?
So we know there's a huge build out of data center capacity going on around the world. We hear a lot about the US, and the US is an incredibly important market, but this is happening in a huge number of markets. And the goal of this report was to think about where is capacity now and where is it easiest to bring new capacity online. So we evaluated 17 markets across the Americas and EMEA to understand what matters when you're siting a data center and how do those markets stack up.
Got it. So, I guess that leads us straight into it. Like, what does matter when you're trying to decide where to build a data center?
Lots of things, but through many, many conversations with data center developers, we settled on 5 broad pillars. So this is energy availability, this is land permitting, this is taxes, fiber connectivity, so that's a measure of how connected the internet is a given market, and then existing live capacity, so how many data centers are there in that market now?
So those are the 5 factors: energy, land permitting, taxes, fiber, live capacity already. And are those all sort of equally important to each other, or do we consider some to be more critical than others?
Some are definitely more critical. Energy was the most important in our ranking because you might hear this phrase, AI is power constrained. At the moment, the limiting factor in most markets is how much power can a data center get, but that's useless without land permitting. If you have nowhere you can build a data center, it doesn't matter if you've got a gigawatt of power. And so energy and land were the 2 most important, with energy marginally more so. Taxes used to be very important, but has become less important over time. And then fiber connectivity and existing market size are quite correlated. So they were both scored in the middle, but made up a sizable chunk together.
Right, I get it. So you didn't want to overweight them because you'll be double counting in that impact in a certain sense. And on the fiber connectivity, does it also depend on the kind of data center you're trying to build, or, the application? Because I'm sure some applications, fiber is more important than others.
Absolutely. So we can kind of split data center workloads into those which are latency sensitive and those which aren't. We're here in London, you're in New York, we're connected virtually. If there was lag in that data center, it would be a nightmare. A data center serving enterprise workloads, communication workloads, has to be in a fiber hub to get that rapid connection. For emerging AI workloads, this is less important. Maybe a year ago, we were talking about building data centers out in the desert, far from anything for AI training. That's kind of declined, but because when we use an AI model, there is thinking time for the model. On top of maybe 10 seconds for an answer, we don't care that much about 10 milliseconds of extra latency. So AI facilities are being sited a little bit further away from the traditional fiber hubs.
That's so interesting. It's opening up new possibilities in a sense. And then finally, live capacity. I just want to really, I know we talked about fiber and live capacity together, but just explain a little bit why live capacity matters so much. Why should it matter? How many data centers have already been built in a region to building more? Because you could look at it one way and say, oh, it should be the other way around because, all the land, all the energy has been chomped up by the ones that have preceded. So why is live capacity a positive factor for developing new data centers?
No, absolutely. There's kind of two reasons live capacity matters. The first is that it is an indicator of how much demand there is in the market now. The biggest data center markets in the world are largely financial hubs and technology hubs, which need a lot of capacity, and that's still true. But the other really important thing is you need to be very skilled to build and operate a data center. We wanted to include labor availability in this ranking. Unfortunately, that's really hard to quantify. Maybe a country reports how many electricians work in the market, but to build a data center, you only need a subset of those who have particular qualifications. We couldn't find a systemic way of tracking that would be comparable between markets. But the fact that a data center was built last week is a pretty good indicator there are people in the market that know how to build a data center. And so it was used as a proxy for that.
Unless it's a really shoddy data center. I don't know what a shoddy data center looks like. So we've kind of established space. We've got these 5 different factors. You guys made a beautiful little bar chart where you stacked up the scores that you assigned to different markets, but you put them all in order of, the one that got the highest score as a market for data centers versus the ones that got the lowest score. So tell us, what was at the top of the list?
The top of the list was the state of Virginia on the east coast of the US.
Got it. And second on the list?
Texas. So 2 US states coming in ahead of many countries.
Gold and silver go to the US. And I suppose people who follow this market shouldn't be surprised. And I know that a lot of the point of this report is to have people thinking beyond the US because we already know so many of the world's data centers are in the US and are being built in these 2 particular states in particular. But just tell us the story a little bit about Virginia and Texas, why it is that they come in so high on the list.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different dynamics going on between the states. Virginia, which is home to over 11% of the live capacity that we track globally, is very, very important because historically it was home to one of the first ever internet exchange points. So this is a bit like an old-fashioned phone switchboard for the internet. Virginia hosted one very, very early. Virginia also introduced tax breaks for data centers. It gave a 100% tax break on sales tax for data center infrastructure. And that kind of gave the industry a foothold into the state. And as we alluded to at the start, there's a snowball effect and there's a network effect. So more capacity went there. It also benefits from where it is geographically. It can serve the eastern seaboard of the US and has subsea cables connecting it to Europe. So that's really what drove Virginia. And it's home to a huge amount of cloud and enterprise infrastructure. Texas is a slightly different story. And really the draw in Texas is there's a lot of land and there's a lot of cheap power. We've seen significant amounts of cryptocurrency mining infrastructure. So this is high performance infrastructure deployed there. And as the AI build out is happening and accelerating, Texas is a really great place to build these huge power hungry AI focused data centers that can do very large workloads.
This is important to establish because this is what all of these other markets we're talking about, this is what they're competing against. 2 markets that have various factors going in their favor, on a sort of in an inherent level. I would say that the factors such as energy, land permitting and taxes, but then also have the incumbency bonus that, of already having that head start. So the thing that's really interesting about everything you've just described with Virginia and Texas is not just the fact that they have some inherent advantages that are definitely real, but don't necessarily stand out to completely set them apart from everyone else. What really sets them apart from everyone else is that they've had this head start. It's where stuff has already been built. And then I referenced this chart you made earlier, when I look at this chart, I ignore the final bar in your sort of rankings, the live capacity bar, the one that is all about the kind of historical advantage different markets have. Virginia and Texas still rank really high on the list. So they do have natural advantages beyond incumbency, but they're not the top. The top markets are Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Brazil. So maybe we'll start with the markets in the Middle East. Tell us a little bit about those, both in terms of why they have such strong advantages and do we have any insights on what's actually going on there in terms of data center development?
Yeah, so these are markets where there's a lot of land. It's relatively easy to permit to use this land, and there's a lot of excess power that's very, very cheap. This all contributed to quite a big score, but there's a gap in our scoring framework, and this gap does create more risk and more uncertainty developing there, and that's geopolitics. We didn't include it in our ranking system because it's incredibly hard to quantify numerically and objectively, which was very, very important as we developed this. It's also much more fast-moving than a lot of the things. We were looking at the 5-year change in installed capacity in a market, whereas geopolitical environments can change much more rapidly. But the Middle East in particular that you've brought up first, under the Biden administration, there were export controls on advanced semiconductors to the region. They were lifted under the Trump administration, but there's no guarantee that will stay. And so that creates extra risk for any developer that wants to extend into the market. And so the question of will you actually be able to get off-takers for that capacity remains.
That's so interesting as factors that penalize Saudi Arabia and UAE are not to do with the inherent advantage of building a data center there. They're more reflective of this increasingly fragmented world we see in terms of the global economy. One thing I'm curious about is that there seems to be two factors here. One is the ability to get the equipment to build the data centers and whether there are trade restrictions there. And you mentioned, some of them were lifted under Trump, but there's always a chance they would come in. But I mean, one question I have is does this equipment have to come from the US? And are there other countries interested in developing data centers in the Middle East? And then is there scope for these Middle Eastern countries to be the kind of the hub for non-US data center development?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things there to unpack. And the first is about supply chains. A trend we're seeing, especially in electrical equipment supply chains, is incumbents are acquiring to develop a regional footprint. We are also talking to lots of companies who want to kind of get in on this data center trade and are looking at exploring into new markets and maybe supplying data centers when that hasn't been a primary market historically. In terms of silicon, so the chips we need to do advanced computation, that still is a primarily US story. NVIDIA has an absolutely huge share of the market for AI inference chips. That's the chip used to build and run AI models. And whilst there are competitors, Google, Amazon have in-house solutions, that's still from American companies. So that will remain a constraint, at least in the coming years, because it takes time to develop the architectures to build this silicon. In terms of demand, you're absolutely right. So many of the companies developing foundational models, these are models like ChatGPT 5.2, Claude Opus 4.6, the huge AI models that other tools are based on. Most of those companies are based in the US. However, there's a growing interest in sovereign AI. Lots of countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE included, have sovereign AI strategy that will involve developing infrastructure onshore and developing software and tools onshore. So whilst there are constraints on chip supply and there are constraints on these huge American companies wanting that infrastructure, midterm, we'd also see a boost as more services are brought onshore and more users in those markets make use of advanced AI tools.
That's so interesting hearing that as someone who's spent their career being an energy analyst. And at BNEF, as energy analysts, we're having to learn all about artificial intelligence because it's so impactful in the energy sector. But actually, leaving aside its impact on the energy sector, there's this other angle that's interesting is we've spent so many decades talking about energy security, and it's why countries are so keen to develop their own domestic energy supplies, even if, there are trade partners globally who could provide energy a lot more cheaply. And, you've seen the importance of that with Europe and its dependence on Russia for gas and how that really has come to the head in the last 5 years or so. And so now we see something equivalent for artificial intelligence. This idea of sovereign AI is this cognition and the power that brings is something that countries are wary of just entrusting to one global partner because there's so much power that comes with that. And I suppose, my question is then, given that in the same way that bringing in the Middle East again, the Middle East is kind of the heartland for oil, and that was a problem to so many countries being so dependent on Middle Eastern oil. The sort of the Saudi Arabia of artificial intelligence is the US. So at the moment, sort of not being a US market is a penalty because much of the equipment, so much of the demand is coming from the US, but it's also a motivating factor for these markets to develop. So even some of these ones in your list that don't score as highly as Virginia and Texas, they have an inherent still drive to build, which is this idea of sovereign AI. Is that what is behind a lot of this, in a sense?
I think that's a factor, but it's complex, as is pretty much every answer.
It's not the only factor.
Yeah, for sure.
So then bringing in the other market I mentioned that seems data center ready but has relatively few built to date is Brazil. So tell us a little bit about the story there.
Yeah, so Brazil is already a regional fiber hub for Latin America. So a huge amount of the internet traffic that's being routed through LATAM is going to be going through exchange points in Brazil. This is expected to continue because of these network effects and this infrastructure. And a huge tailwind is that the population in Brazil in particular, and surrounding countries more generally, is young and is rapidly getting richer. So it's spending more time online. That will drive domestic demand for cloud services and for internet services such as social media. But the other thing we're starting to see in Brazil are companies developing or planning to develop what we might call more speculative AI projects. And the driving idea is there are constraints in the US. We've spoken that things are great in Virginia and Texas, but there are still headwinds. And so as AI labs scale rapidly, there is hope from some developers that they'll be able to sell capacity in Brazil to American tech firms. Whether or not that manifests is uncertain. And Brazil has this huge pipeline. So if we look at what's been announced in Brazil versus what there is, it has by far the biggest ratio of pipeline to current. But about 90% of that is in 2 mega projects that are trying to serve USAI in the way I've mentioned. And so that's just some uncertainty as the market progresses, although the growing domestic demand is likely to be very strong.
So it's you mentioned 2 projects, so it's quite lumpy at the moment. It's not necessarily looking like it's growing organically, but it could be a huge boost if these mega projects come through and provide real momentum there.
For sure. And we would definitely consider medium term there to be a lot of growth in a similar way to some markets that weren't included in this note, but will be profiled in upcoming features through Southeast Asia. As these populations use internet more heavily for all parts of life, that stimulates demand for cloud services and enterprise services, which will be correlated with and will drive lots of data center development.
I was in Brazil a couple of years ago. I had to give a presentation for an event we were doing internally, and I had to read up and kind of get smart on Brazil really quickly. But at the time, I was really struck by how well positioned Brazil was, and in a large part because it has a almost zero carbon grid because of the huge amounts of hydro that are already built in Brazil. And so therefore, the ability to develop low carbon industries, Brazil extremely well positioned. Do you think there's this one thing that might be in the back of some of these US companies developing AI is that when climate change does rise up on the agenda again and people already question the environmental impact of AI, these Brazilian data centers, you may be able to claim that this is green or greener AI than the rest? Or do you think that's not really a motivating factor at the moment?
I think it's not nothing. The largest...
That's a very diplomatic answer. That's what I was saying. Your question was wide of the mark. Such a long time asking it as well.
No, it is a thing. The big tech companies have very ambitious corporate sustainability goals, and many of them have invested huge amounts in bringing renewable capacity online through PPAs. Google, for example, have invested a lot and worked a lot on 24/7 matching for renewable generation and their data center capacity. That historically has been important to these companies, and it's been important in the tech sector more broadly. We spend a lot of time speaking to data center developers who maybe want to rent out capacity to a smaller tech firm. Most of those historically have prioritized clean energy. But we've really seen a shift in the last couple of years because, as I kind of said at the start, the sector is increasingly power constrained, and there's this zero-sum belief that more compute will mean bigger market share and better AI models now. And the first company to hit some kind of benchmark, some kind of threshold, will win very big, and the others will fall away. That belief is causing the cleanness of energy to drop down in rankings short term. And we're actually seeing a lot of on-site gas and fossil generation more generally to support this build out.
And is that also true in Brazil, would you say?
In Brazil, not yet. So that's typically happening in the markets which have really, really hot demand, which are going to be indicators of markets scoring well on fiber and well on live capacity, but are struggling to energize and meet that demand. Brazil does have this excess renewable energy that you've highlighted, and that's one of the key value propositions of these mega projects that are being planned there. But the real question is, will a tech company in the US or elsewhere want to lease that capacity, or would they rather have it at home fossil powered? For now, the at home fossil powered seems to be winning. The other thing is, as we look at how the emissionality of these companies is being reported, the emissions or lack thereof from the power they're purchasing for data centers wouldn't be coming into their reporting. That's going to be their scope 3, which isn't really what most of them are going to be interested in. And so it's a relatively low priority.
Let's move on to some other markets, because I think you reviewed 17 markets in your report, and we obviously are not going to talk about every single one in all of their minutiae. And we've talked about the ones that were really at the top of the list. So Virginia, Texas, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Brazil. Was the top 5. 9, I think, of the 17 markets you reviewed were in Europe. So none of them were in the top 5, but it's still quite significant that there's so many that you included in Europe. And so maybe none of them is quite the sort of home run that some of the ones in the top 5 are, but tell us a little bit about, just in general terms, what the picture in Europe is like. And then maybe we can dive into some of the more interesting or more significant markets that you've noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, at the start of this conversation, we were saying Virginia and Texas, part of why they're really attractive and doing really well is because they have huge amounts of existing capacity. In Europe, we're kind of seeing the converse. And so the traditional tier 1 markets in Europe, the top data center markets, have formed in the metropolitan areas around Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin, which has the lovely acronym FLAP-D. These are major technology and financial hubs, and data center capacity has built there because those industries needed it, and they needed it early. They've now evolved into key centers for internet exchange and for cloud computing. So they're still really attractive, but it's hard to get energy in these markets. It's often hard and complicated to get permission to build, and local attitudes to projects are really quite hostile compared to some other places in Europe. And so FLAP-D is kind of still very attractive, but challenging. And then we spoke about our European growth markets. So in the Nordics and in Iberia, we see good land availability, relatively easier permitting processes, and relatively better energy availability. They don't yet have the fiber infrastructure that the FLAP-D hubs in Tier 1 do, but they have many other structural advantages. And so, one line summary of what we'd expect to see in Europe: Cloud compute and enterprise compute stays in or near FLAP-D. AI compute and large-scale deployments move more towards Iberia or up into the Nordics.
So I take your point that the traditional data centers are likely to get built in FLAP-D, and then the emerging applications like the Nordics and Spain look pretty promising. And actually, I head up our global power markets work. One of our analysts is currently working on a report. I'm sure you've spoken with her a lot about this, is about data centers being built in the Nordics. Or it's about power demand in the Nordics, but you can't ignore the data centers. So that's really interesting. What I'm kind of curious about is France, which came kind of out of all the European countries, it came top of your rankings. Is France positioned at least to kind of be both? Apart from Finland, it has the highest energy availability according to your rankings, due in large part, I'm sure, because of all the surplus nuclear. And France, for those of you not familiar with the way that power works in Europe, France is just constantly exporting power to the rest of Europe. So if you use up some more power in France, they just have to export a little bit less to everyone else. But France is always going to be fine. And there's the fiber network is there. So do you think that France could be kind of both?
Yeah, and we are already seeing this. So we spoke a little bit earlier on about foundational AI models, these companies that are building huge AI tools. And I said most of them are in the US. There's also a group in China. There is one European champion, really, and that is Mistral, a French company. Mistral is developing an AI training facility in the Cambrai region. Apologies to any French speakers for my pronunciation there, just northeast of Paris. And so, yeah, we're seeing deployments. We've also seen the end of the RNH mechanism for EDF, the French state energy provider, selling nuclear. That's ended, which means it's now looking for private sector commercial off-takers. Data centers have been identified as a good target customer. And so EDF is in the process of selling 4, possibly going to be extended to 6 plots of powered land, which will provide nuclear energy for a data center on site at AI scale. So yeah, tailwinds in France.
Two things I'm going to ask you to define there: powered land, and put a number around what we mean by AI scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So powered land is, you ask 20 people in this space what they mean, you'll probably get 20 different answers. What we mean here are plots of land that are pre-permitted, so they're ready to build, and they have got a source of power, in this case, a grid connection to a nuclear asset, ready to go. This is a plot of land that EDF is saying, however many football fields of space, build a data center, plug it in, and all of that's taken care of for you. And then I think the other question was AI scale. Similarly, 20 people, 20 answers. Really, we're talking about the hundreds of megawatts, if not low gigawatts of capacity. 4 plots EDF have offered up come to somewhere around 2 gigawatts together. So that kind of gives you a sense of just how big we mean.
It's huge. It's small compared to Virginia, but it kind of similar to what we were talking about with Brazil. Once you get some data centers of that scale built, it's almost like you've got over the hill in terms of, can you build data centers at that scale? So we assume that if those large scale projects happen, suddenly now France has an incumbency advantage in this race. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yes. Caveated on, the network effect and snowball effect on large scale AI projects is probably going to be lower than for more traditional data centers because, as we said at the start, AI facilities care that little bit less about low latency connection. But France does have structural advantages. Deploying this will make it more attractive. And it's also, the government is hugely supportive of AI infrastructure and has helped secure 110 billion euros, which is 112 billion US dollars of private sector investment to help build and develop this data center capacity. That's vastly more than in the UK, which has similar ambition, but has only secured around 31.5 billion US dollars of private sector investment to support its data center sector.
Firstly, I'm really impressed with your currency conversions on the fly. If, a few really huge projects could be significant, although, I do take on board your caveat. Are there any other really large-scale projects across Europe or not even necessarily projects, like the equivalents of this powered land you have in France. Are there any other examples of countries where there's a sort of a nicely set up opportunity to get ahead on this game?
Yeah, absolutely. So to BNEF subscribers, people with access to this note, start of section 5, we've got a map of the European pipeline, and you can see where the large announced projects are. But really what we're seeing are a number in the northeast of England and up into Scotland around the UK's AI growth zone policy. We're seeing projects in the north of the Nordics, and we're seeing projects into Spain and also the Start campus in Portugal. Things I'd really flag are Stargate Europe. So this is a project tied to US AI firm OpenAI, company that makes ChatGPT, in Norway, and then the hyperscalers, so Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon, also have large-scale deployments, notably in the Nordics.
And the Nordics makes sense to me because there's a huge amount of either hydro or nuclear, or hydro and nuclear, and I know those data centers are under development in the parts of the Nordics where there's low demand but high generation. I'm kind of curious about Spain and Portugal as well. I mean, I realize there's a lot of hydro in Portugal, but a lot of the kind of the energy abundance emerging in Spain is relating to solar and excess solar. Does that caveat the advantage that Spain has in terms of energy availability, or am I oversimplifying it or sort of missing a factor there?
So I guess there's a couple of things we could think about in answer to that. One that I'm just not going to be able to get into here, but is around data center flexibility. This is something lots of groups are increasingly thinking about and exploring. So how can data centers make themselves more flexible and move their load to better match generation curves? But yeah, you're exactly right. Solar in Spain. And this is what's drawing a lot of these projects into the market. So auctions, the bid process for a grid connection, if it's contested, data centers are systemically disadvantaged against decarbonisation and clean industry as a result of Spanish government policy. But via Royal Decree 1183 in 2020, you can use up to 50% of the capacity you generate on site. That has created a market opportunity for data centers to co-locate with solar. And we're seeing solar developers in Spain providing powered land, a bit like EDF in France, to a data center, saying, look, you can get a grid connection here. You can use our solar really cheaply when the sun is shining. And then you've got that grid connection to bring power in when it's not. So that's a win for solar developers because it helps them to close the missing money gap that BNEF wrote about in the last Spanish Power Outlook. And it's a win for data centers because it means they can get a grid connection.
So it's a win-win for both sides of the party. Lloyd, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I think you've said on multiple times in response to my questions that it's a little bit more complex than that, which is fair. And I suppose what I'm learning here is, I mean, you've kind of distilled it down into 5 pillars in terms of, where we expect data centers to get built in the markets that you've covered, or, what factors will determine that. But even doing that, there's still more factors. We talked about sovereign AI, we talked about the emissions perspective and sort of the role that government can play. And so it really paints a picture of an interesting space in the next 5 years or so, that there are a lot of markets that maybe aren't on the radar as places where AI is getting built, but there are many that potentially could be. I'm sure that not all of them will be. And so I think it's going to be really interesting seeing what happens in the next 5 years, what emerges as the new Virginia, for Europe, or the new Texas, but in the Middle East. And so we're keeping our eye on that. And so this has really opened my eyes as to why I'm based in the US. I look at power markets. So much of my fixation is on the impact of data centers in those 2 markets, Virginia and Texas. But you've actually really opened my mind up to why this could be so much bigger than that and impact so many more markets. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you.
No, it's been great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on, Tom.
Today's episode of Switched On was produced by Cam Gray with production assistance from Kamala Schelling. BloombergNEF is a service provided by Bloomberg Finance LP and its affiliates. This recording does not constitute, nor should it be construed as investment advice, investment recommendations, or a recommendation as to an investment or other strategy. BloombergNEF should not be considered as information sufficient upon which to base an investment decision. Neither Bloomberg Finance LP nor any of its affiliates makes any representation or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of the information contained in this recording, and any liability as a result of this recording is expressly disclaimed.